Great honor and pleasure to introduce to you, as she walks toward us, Mrs. Gol Aidun, who has come from a long way. One of our speakers this afternoon has come from Arkansas, the other one from BC, and the third one comes from Manitoba. Gol, please come.
The chairman made a very kind remark. He said, I'm well qualified to speak on this subject. But unfortunately, I'm really not well qualified because when my parents became Baha'i, I was born that same year, and so I really don't know much about the background, and I have lived mostly in this part of the world and in Pakistan and other areas. But anyway, I was very interested in this subject because I had to write a paper comparing the Zoroastrians of India and the Zoroastrians that are known as Gabr of Iran. And so I was visiting Iran and India that year, and so I thought I'd go and do some research on that. And when I went and visited some places, I realized in Yazd that there was this bust of Manekji in front of the fire temple there, and when I asked them, they said, oh, he's Manekji, he was from India and he did so much for Iran. And I was shocked because I had never heard about him. And then when I went to India, again I went to visit this Dastur and ask him about the Parsis, the Zoroastrians in India are called Parsis. To ask him about the Parsis in India and compare them to the Zoroastrians in Iran. And he mentioned Manekji because there was a beautiful painting there, and I'm interested in painting. And I said, whose painting is that? And he said, that was Manekji. And Manekji did so much for Iran. And don't you know about him? I said, no, I don't know anything about him. And that's when I became very, very interested. And then E.G. Brown's book, A Year Amongst the Persian, I picked up that book and I saw that this Manekji is mentioned in that book, and so that really raised my curiosity, and this is when I started writing this paper. But I ran into a lot of trouble because most of the writings that pertains to the Bahá'í Faith is written in Persian mixed with Arabic, and my husband unfortunately cannot read Arabic. So I had to catch hold of these Persians that I could find around here, and I especially went to the convention so I could see some of these Persian people who knew something about these tablets that were written to Manekji. And after a while I noticed that as soon as they would see me coming, they would all run away from me because I kept on talking to them about Manekji. And then my brother-in-law said, why don't we go and have lunch this afternoon? I said, oh good, now we can talk about Manekji and you can translate this tablet for me. And I turned to say hello to a friend, and the next thing I knew he had disappeared. And I wrote to my sister that I needed a certain book very much because he wrote a book about his travels in Iran, Manekji wrote. And I told my sister, you must find that book. And she stopped writing to me. I haven't heard from her for 3 months because she said every time that Gol writes to me or talks to me, it's nothing but Manekji. And my family kept saying they don't want to hear one more word about Manekji. So I'll be very glad when I've finished with Manekji today. Manekji Limji Hataria and the Bahá'í Faith. Baha'u'llah wrote, know thou moreover that we have addressed to the Magians our tablets and adorned them with our law. We have revealed in them the essence of all the hints and allusions contained in their books. The Lord verily is the Almighty, the All-Knowing. And one of the Magians who was the recipient of such tablets was Manekji Limji Hataria. As a matter of fact, he received several tablets from Baha'u'llah. He was a Zoroastrian from India, affectionately known as Manekji Sáheb in Iran. In 1854, he had the rare privilege of meeting Baha'u'llah in Baghdad when he was returning to Iran. Manekji was son of Limji Hataria Kayani, and he was born in the village of Mora, Somali, near Surat in India in 1813, and he passed away in Iran in 1890. One of the Zoroastrian writes very pitifully, he says, "We do not even know the early history of this great man, that for whom it is believed by many that Zoroastrianism would have nearly died in the country of its birth." Manekji traveled extensively in India as a commercial agent for Jahangirji, Nosirwanji and Company, and soon became its manager and director in 1845. Physically, Manekji was a strong and sturdy man, able to endure the rough conditions of life and travel then prevailing. And to the devotion of his faith and community, he added admirable innate qualities like charity, honesty, tact and patience in negotiation. And what was of prime importance, both moral and physical courage. Manekji was appointed as the first emissary by the Society for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Zoroastrians in Persia, founded in 1854 by the Zoroastrians in India. What was the condition of the Zoroastrians like at that time? And to understand the situation, we'll have to go back into history. In the 7th century, when the Arabs, pulsating with religious zeal, swept across Iran, a change almost unparalleled in history was in the course of a few years brought over that land, where for centuries the ancient hymns of the Avesta had been chanted, and the sacred fire had burned, and the call summoning the faithful to prayer rang out from minarets, reared on the ruins of the temples of Ahura Mazda, and soon none were left to represent a mighty faith but a handful of exiles sailing towards the shores of Iran, and a despised and persecuted remnant in solitary Yaz and remote Kirman. Actually, my parents, they come from Yaz too, and my father and mother, they both were very young when their families came to Iran because of the persecution. Dastur Dala laments that the crescent superseded the Kaaba banner, and Shahanshah was followed by Khalif, and Urmez was followed by Allah, and Zardosh gave place to Muhammad, and the Quran was supplanted by the Avesta. Tens of thousands embraced Islam to find relief from the persecution that raged around them. Others became converts because conversion brought to them exemption from the payment of the poll tax, which was known as the jizya. The late Mr. Buluzi narrates a humorous episode of how the governor of Khorasan was very perturbed because so many Persians had come into the faith and accepted Islam to escape from the poll tax, but had not bothered to be circumcised. And the Caliph's answer was simple and fierce. He said, God sent the Prophet to reveal true faith to men and not to circumcise them. Writing to their co-religionists in India in the 15th century, the Gabr, the Zoroastrians, they were called Gabr with contempt by the Muslims at that time. The Gabr of Iran complained that ever since the overthrow of the empire, they are living under such troublesome times that the atrocities of an Alexander pale before what they had been suffering for 9 centuries. But the fall of Kirman to the Afghans in 1768 put an end to the correspondence between the Gabr of Iran and the Parsis in India. The death of the benevolent Karim Khan Zand threw India into further upheaval, and during the early 19th century, there was no more contact worth mentioning between the two communities. Conditions got so bad. The destinies of the two communities during this period were diametrically opposed to each other. Whereas the Parsis under British protection, and because increasingly westernized, prospered in commerce and industry, The Gabs, ruined by the sack of their town and engaged exclusively in agriculture, were subject as non-Muslims to attacks which became heavier and heavier and out of proportion to their resources. A relentless persecution was exercised against them in 100 different ways. Their property recently acquired could be taxed to the advantage of the mullahs up to the fifth of its value. It was forbidden to build new homes or repair old ones. Their sanctuaries were often desecrated. They could not wear new clothes or ride on a horse, only mules and asses. Napier Malcolm, who spent 5 years in Yazd, wrote in 1905 that Yazd has the reputation of being one of the most bigoted towns of Persia. The presence of the Zoroastrian remnant who were subject to the grossest persecution served only to keep alive the fire of religious hatred, and the atmosphere of the town resembled that of a prep school for little boys. Up to 1895, no Parsi was allowed to carry an umbrella. Up to 1895, there was a prohibition upon eyeglasses. I couldn't have read without them. Up to 1885, they were prevented from wearing rings. Their girdles had to be made of rough canvas. Up to 1896, the Parsis were obliged to twist their turbans instead of folding them. Up to 1898, only brown, grey and yellow was allowed for the gaba, that's the outer garment. There was a prohibition against white stockings. Up to 1880, they had to wear a hideous shoe with a broad turned-up toe. Up to 1885, they had to wear a torn cap. Up to 1880, they had to wear tight knickers, self-colored instead of trousers. And the houses had to be built so low that the top could be reached by a Mussalman with his hands extended. The walls had to be splashed with white color around the door. Up to 1860, Parsis could not engage in trade. Up to 1870, they were not permitted to have a school for their children. And in 1860, a man of 70 went to the bazaars in white trousers of rough canvas. They beat him, took off his trousers, and sent him home with them under his arm. And in 1880, the Gabs were made to wear an obvious patch on their shirt. I'm pointing these dates out because it was only after Manekji went to Iran that he was able to ameliorate these grievances. Professor E.G. Brown writes how in 1888, when he was in Yazd, a Zoroastrian was bastinadoed for accidentally touching with his garment some fruit exposed for sale in the bazaar. And my mother, she still remembers when she was 5 years old. She still remembers when she was 5 years old that as a young child, her mother would send her to buy some sugar or bread or something like this. And she used to get so nervous because every time she went, that the man would tell her, "You dirty, filthy Zoroastrian, throw the coin in that pot." And there used to be a pot full of water put in front there, and they had to throw the money in there so that it could be washed before the man would pick the money up. And she said it was so scaring for her. Every time her parents told her to go and buy something, it used to scare her so much, and she has never forgotten that yet. And thereby, in the eyes of Muslims, rendering it unclean and unfit for consumption by true believers. They were regarded as pagans, not equal even to Christians, Jews, and other people of the book. And the hypocrites amongst the Arabs complained that Muhammad pretended that the poll tax should be accepted only from the people in the book, and now he had accepted from the Magians of Hajar, who are not even the people of the book. They were not considered people of the book. Also, the Zoroastrians lived in ghettos, known as Gabr Mohalla, and invented the Dari dialect, which was only used by the Gabr themselves so that even a Yazdi Mussalman cannot understand what they were saying. It is for this reason that the Zoroastrians cherish their dari and are somewhat unwilling to teach it to a stranger. My family still speaks Dari and it upsets me very much because I can't understand it very well either. And E.G. Brown speaks in his book, A Year Amongst the Persians, that how he tried to learn it from the Zoroastrians when he was in Yazd, but they refused to teach him. They couldn't even trust him. They were afraid he would go and maybe teach it to the others. And it was during the period of confusion after the death of Muhammad Shah and the accession of Nasruddin Shah that many of the Zoroastrians were robbed, beaten and threatened with death, unless they would renounce the ancient faith and embrace Islam. And it was then that Manekji Sáheb was appointed and sent to Iran. When he arrived in Bushir, there was a lot of confusion because of the death of the Shah, and he was unable to achieve much except to return home with first-hand information on the pitiful conditions of the Zoroastrians in India. This situation greatly affected their brethren in India, who were now prosperous and able to take action for their relief. Hence, the Society for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Zoroastrians in Persia was founded in 1854, and they sent as their first agent Manekji Hataria in the spring of that year. His most important task was to procure from the Persian government the abolition of the poll tax and improve the lot of the dwindling Zoroastrian community. Manekji soon became greatly respected and known amongst the foreign diplomats and the Persian society in Iran. S.G.W. Benjamin, the American ambassador to Persia at that time, wrote of Manekji. He said, "The head of the Gabr in Persia is a very respectable and intelligent old gentleman named Manekji, delegated to look after the Gabr interests in Persia." Manekji was also well known to Gobineau, who was the French ambassador to Persia at that time in 1856 to 1858, and he took an absorbing interest in the Bahá'í Faith and the Zoroastrians. He reproduced in his book the census of the Zoroastrians in Iran, which was supplied to him by Manekji. Gobineau wrote that Manekji Limji Hataria has accomplished this work of charity with zeal and intelligence, which do him honor in the highest degree, and with him to the community to which he belongs. Manekji Limji Sáheb has undertaken a task above human capacity. He must perform nothing short of a miracle to save the world, and he did just that. For in spite of great obstacles, Manekji was able to achieve a great deal over the 3 decades that he was in Iran. He returned once more to Bombay in 1864, delivered an important address in the bungalow of Mirwanji Pandey, one of the important founders of the society, and presented the problems and possible solutions. And he returned to Iran in 1865, never to return again to India. And before leaving India, he wrote the book Ishar-e-Sayyat-e Iran, in which he writes about his trip to Iran. And that was the book that I have been trying so hard to get from India. And just yesterday I had a letter from this Zoroastrian friend who's been doing a lot of research on the Zoroastrian religion, that she has made photocopy it and sent to me, and I haven't received it yet, so I haven't been able to get much out of that book. Well, anyway, Napier Malcolm notes that in the reign of Nasruddin Shah, Manekji, a British Parsi from India, was for a long while in Tehran as Parsi representative. And almost all the Parsi disabilities were withdrawn. The jizya, the clothes and riding restrictions, and those with regard to houses. But the law of inheritance was not altered. The jizya was actually remitted, and also some of the restrictions onto houses, but the rest of the farman remained a dead letter. The great difficulty was not to get the law improved, but rather to get it enforced. When Manekji was in Yazd in 1870, 2 Parsis were attacked by 2 Mussalmans outside the town, and one was killed and the other terribly wounded. and as they had tried to cut off his head. The governor brought the criminals to Yazd but did nothing about it. Manekji then got leave to take them to Tehran. The Prime Minister, however, told him that no Mussalman would be killed for a Zardushti, and they would only be vaccinated. About this time, Manekji inquired whether it was true that the blood price of a Zardushti was to be 7 per month, which at that time was less than $1. And he got back the official reply that it was a little over. Besides renovating and building fire temples and dakhmas are the burial places for the Zoroastrians, Manekji set about to raise the standard of education of the youth in this community. He instituted boarding schools and encouraged students to acquire learning. He donated one of his own houses in Tehran to be used as an elementary school for the welfare of the students. Nearly 40 students attended the Zoroastrian school, coming as far away as Kirman and Yazd. Manekji and his wife worked very hard to manage the school, but unfortunately they did not know the Persian language too well, and this coincided with the difficult time that Mirza Abul Fazl of Gol Aidun was having at that time. He had been expelled as a teacher from the government school, and his belongings were taken away by his brother. And Manekji had made acquaintance of the Baha'is at that time, and he came to hear about Mirza Abul Fazl and his great capabilities and his efforts for promoting the pure Persian language. And Manekji then invited Mirza Abul Fazl to join the school and teach Persian literature, and at that same time become his secretary. And Mirza Abul Fazl accepted the offer and worked for Manekji from 1876 to 1882. And many of the students of Mirza Abul Fazl became men of learning and later accepted the Bahá'í Faith. And some of them was Mullah Bahram. Maybe some of the Yazdis who are here will probably know who Mullah Bahram was. And Ustad Jawan Mard. Where is Dr. Jawan Mardi? Ustad Jawan Mard was the grandfather of Dr. Jawan Mardi. And I remember the convention, he was one of those that I took aside and I dragged him. I said, let's go and sit in that corner so nobody will disturb us. I want to ask you more about Ustad Jawan Mard and Shir Mand who wrote this article. And so we went in the corner, and afterwards he wasn't able to, he said he'd send me some literature on it, but I'm still waiting for it. And then afterwards one of the Persians came to me and says, I hate to ask you this question, Gol, but are you and your husband separated? Because he saw that I was doing such funny things for pulling people here and pulling people there. They couldn't understand what was happening at that point. Anyway, Ustad Jawan Mard was the grandfather of Dr. Jawan. Am I right here? Yeah. Abdul Baha praised Abul Fazl as being fearless. He was equipped with the knowledge of the holy scriptures of all religions, and he knew the contents of the Avesta, Zend Avesta, and the Zoroastrian literature very well. And he was a real genius. But the most important service rendered by Manekji to the Zoroastrian community of Iran was the abolishing of the poll tax known as jizya. He began his campaigns against it in 1857 and would not rest till it was exempted in August 1882. Manekji left no stone unturned. He even obtained an audience with the Nasruddin Shah, after which the total due from the community was reduced. He also received help from Sir Henry Rawlings, the British ambassador at the court of Tehran. And in England, when Nasruddin Shah was in Buckingham Palace, he was presented with an address by the representative of the Amelioration Society in London. The address, which mainly centered around the supplication for the annulment of the jizya, was supported both by Sir Henry Rawlinson and E.B. Eastwick, the Oriental scholar. Professor E.G. Brown seems to think that the jizya was a just arrangement for Magians as well as Christians were permitted to retain their religion, being merely compelled to pay a jizya poll tax, a perfectly just arrangement, he says, inasmuch as non-Muslim subjects of the Caliph were necessarily exempt both from military service and from arms, and which was obligatory on the Prophet's followers. But as Dr. Boyce, she did a lot of research on the Manekji when he was in Iran, and I even wrote a letter to her, and she said that she had never heard about that Manekji had ever visited Baha'u'llah, and unfortunately I couldn't get much help there either. But as Professor Boyce points out, that however defensible this may be historically, in practice and in the hands of unscrupulous tax farmers, it became a harsh tool for exaction, brutality, and forced conversion. It was the way that they used to collect these taxes was so cruel. But the Farrash, who was the tax collector, was at liberty to do what he liked with collecting the jizya. The man was not even allowed to go home to fetch the money, but beaten until it was given. In 1865, a Farrash collecting this tax tied a man to a dog and gave a blow to each in turn. After his arrival on the scene, Manekji paid out of the amelioration fund for those who were unable to pay the tax, and later paid the total amount, so there was no need for the individuals to be harassed and humiliated. Finally, the imperial firman giving them tax exemption was issued in the month of Ramzan, August 18, 1882, which stated that we have made an abatement of this sum and free the Zoroastrians from it forever, thus fulfilling one of the prophecies which stated that during God's new revelation, the people adhering to a God-given book shall be exempted from religious taxes. Janab Khosrow Beman Sabit, a devout believer, wrote that he was familiar with the Zoroastrian priest Dastur Tirandaz of Yazd, who was well disposed towards the Baha'is. He was on friendly terms with the local Muslim religious leader, Sheikh Muhammad Hassan Sabziwari by name. One day their talk turned to the advent of the Promised One, and the Muslim priest asked the Dastur his views on the matter. The Dastur said that the Promised One had already appeared in the person of Baha'u'llah, and to support this spoke of a telegram received that day from Nasruddin Shah, exempting his community from any further payment of the poll tax. This, the Dastur claimed, was in the Zoroastrian eyes one of the signs of the presence of the universal manifestation on earth. Actually, this man, Janab Khosrow Beman Sabit, as a child, I remember him very vaguely. He was greatly responsible for my mother having accepted the faith, because he was in Yazd, but later on he came and settled in Pune, and we were very fortunate. My father afterwards, when he became a Baha'i, he took over his business in India, and his sons are still alive and in England, and he was able to help me to find this interesting letter. And this Dr. Beman says he wasn't a Baha'i then, he was a Zoroastrian, he was just a young man. And when the Dastur told the mullah this, that this is the prophecy, and he said, oh, they should have never done this. How dare they pass this farman? I'm going to stop them from doing this. And so when the officials came to hear about it, they stripped him of his offices, and that upset Dastur Tirandaz very much. He was very upset about it, that maybe he was the cause of all this trouble happening, and he became very sick. And he told Khosrow Beman, he said, will you please go and fetch this Dr. Ibrahim, he's a Baha'i doctor, and get him immediately, I don't feel good. And so this was the first introduction that Mr. Khosrow Beman had to the Baha'i Faith, when he met this Baha'i doctor. And eventually he became a Baha'i, and very staunch Baha'i. And he was one of the founders of the faith in India. He was very staunch. It is interesting to note here that the first time that Manekji appealed to Nasruddin Shah with the request to get the poll tax exempted, he was unable to do so. And he became very discouraged and disappointed. Manekji then, through Mirza Abul Fazl, wrote to Baha'u'llah in Baghdad and requested his guidance, which was given to him. And the next time that Manekji approached the Shah, his request was granted. Manekji was also most zealous at book collecting, and whomsoever he deemed capable of writing and composing, he would urge to write a book. And one day it happened that Mirza Hussain of Hamadan, a Babi, and Muhammad Ismail Khan, a writer, were Manekji's guests at supper, and Manekji requested each one of them to write a book. He requested Muhammad Ismail Khan to write a history of the kings of Persia, and begged Mirza Hussain to compile a history of the Babis. And Mirza Hussain, according to Mirza Abul Fazl, at that time was secretary to one of the ministers of the Persian government. And at that time, when Nasruddin Shah was in Europe in 1873, he too was in the royal suite. On his return to Iran, he was imprisoned because of his religious affiliation, because he was a Babi. And after his release from prison of Tehran, he was employed by Manekji Sáheb, who treated him with great respect. For had he not become notorious as a Babi, he would have never engaged in this book, writes E.G. Brown. I have to skip some of this because this paper has been too long, and I was supposed to give it on Sunday, and I thought I'd have all the time to delete stuff, and unfortunately they put me up a bit too early today. Mirza Abul Fazl then advised Mirza Hussain to get the records of the events. Mirza Hussain Hamadani then asked Mirza Abul Fazl what could he do and who should he approach to write these books. And so Mirza Abul Fazl then advised Mirza Hussain to get the records of the events recorded by the late Haji Mirza Jani of Kashan and seek Haji Sayyid Jawad of Karbala's assistance in reading the rough draft to him. For he, from the beginning of the manifestation of the first point, that is the Bab, until the arrival of His Holiness Baha'u'llah in Akka, accompanied the friends everywhere in prison and is thoroughly informed of the facts. And at the request of Manekji, Mirza Abul Fazl wrote the first 2 pages of that book, which came to be known as Tarikh-e-Jadid, or New History of Mirza Ali Muhammad the Bab. And this book has been again reprinted, and I was very fortunate to get a copy of it from McGill University so that I could get some of the facts from it. I think it's reprinted in Holland. Professor E.G. Brown, the only Westerner to have met Baha'u'llah at that time, translated it from Persian into English. At the time of translation, he had difficulty in finding out who the true author of the Tarikh-e-Jadid was, as some ascribed it to Mirza Abul Fazl and some ascribed it to Manekji. Mirza Abul Fazl, in his epistle of Alexander to Captain Tomuski, informed Professor Brown that the Tarikh-e-Jadid was written under the supervision of Manekji by Mirza Hussain of Hamadan, based on Mirza Jani's history in 1880, and that Manekji had shaped the history to his own liking, and that the latter was unable to write the Arabic character with ease. Also that Manekji would not suffer the history to be finished in the manner which the writer had suggested, but compelled the chronicler to write what he had dictated. For Manekji's custom was to bid his secretary write down some matter and afterwards read the rough draft to him, which he made in accordance with his own taste. After Manekji had made additions here and there, he used to make a fair copy. And since Manekji had no great skill or science in the Persian language, the style of most of the books attributed to him is disconnected and broken, good and bad mingled together. In addition to this defect, ignorant scribes and illiterate writers have, in accordance with their own fancies, so altered the Tarikh-e-Jadid that at the present day every copy of it appears like a defaced portrait or a restored temple, to such a degree that one cannot obtain a correct copy of it, unless it were the author's own transcript, otherwise no copy can be relied upon. Unfortunately, even its translator, E.G. Brown, has made so many alterations and admits, saying, "Here follow some 20 pages of controversial matter. Of these, as well as of another portion of the conclusion, which I have not thought worth translating." But Manekji concludes that the Tarikh-e-Jadid with apologies. He says, "Let not my readers find fault if my style lacks grace and elegance, for firstly, the language in which I write is not my mother tongue, nor have I enjoyed opportunities of perfecting myself therein, and I aimed but fulfilling a need. And secondly, my sole object was to record facts." I'll have to delete some of this here. Manekji was going to write a second volume on Baha'u'llah, but unfortunately, Mirza Hussain of Hamadan, who wrote the history on the Bab, he died, he passed away after he had completed the Tarikh-e-Jadid, so the second volume could not be started on. One wonders why Manekji, who was such a devout Zoroastrian, devoted so much of his time writing about Bab and Baha'u'llah, especially at a time when both the Zoroastrians and the Babis were highly persecuted. He confused many, including Professor Brown, who translated the book, for in some passages the author implies that he is a Christian. Certain expressions would suggest that he was a believer in the Babi religion. Certain others would seem to imply that he was only a sympathetic onlooker. He tells us why he wrote the Tarikh-e-Jadid. He said, "For since the writer during his travels in Persia became fully cognizant of the history and doctrines of this sect, Babi, he felt himself impelled by sympathy and common humanity to compose this book, that perchance by its instrumentality these discords and blind enmities may be removed, and men may be led to pursue the path of unity and concord. For I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears how the Babis were everywhere hunted down, and wherever found, doomed to death without inquiry or explanation. And this period of massacre and plunder endured for a long while, for whomsoever they pointed out to the Farashis as a Babi was put to death without much ado. I marveled much, saying to myself, what can these people see in this new faith? And what power of men has it made them that they recoil in fear neither from death nor bondage? Rather they consent to abandon their riches, their wives and children, yea, even the life itself. And I inquired, Manekji said, of sundry doctors and men of learning amongst the Shiites concerning the nature of this people's belief and the sources whence they drew the information. And the answer which I received was that they believed the Bab to be the Imam Mahdi, held their wives and possessions in common, regarded both alike to belonging to God alone, and accounted lawful the drinking of wine and every kind of immorality, as well as other things prohibited by Islam, and asserted that one woman might, and indeed should, have 9 husbands. Hearing of such follies, I was disposed to regard these people as madmen until I became acquainted with certain learned men belonging to this sect, that's the Babis, and heard that every one of those who had been taken and put to death had been a master of eloquence, an authority in matters of learning, and an object of general esteem. And then he quotes some of them like Mullah Hussain Bushruya and Yahya of the Arab. And he said, this increased my astonishment by finding such person amongst the Babis, for thought I to myself, it cannot be that men so wise and so gifted should believe in the absurdities which they are credited by the ignorant. And so Manekji had great admiration and respect for the Bab himself, for whenever I had occasion to mention that illustrious Sayyid, that is the Bab, I, for several reasons, alluded to him in terms of the utmost respect. For in the first place, the claim which he advanced was a great one, and he was an illustrious descent and a Sayyid of the people. And secondly, he suffered martyrdom for reason of his love for his nation and his attempts to admonish and regenerate them. And then he quotes again, he says, I have examined the doctrines and practices of every sect and have studied the tenets and ethics of all faiths and religions. In their words and deeds I have seen nothing but what is good, and in sincerity, integrity, charity and godliness I have detected no flaw. Yet Manekji never did accept the Bahá'í Faith. One wonders if he considered it as a sect of Islam, for he writes that such were the diversities of opinions and such the multiplicity of sects which I beheld in this religion. Then he named Sheikhis and Sufis and Sunnis and mystics, Darwishis, the Babis, that though my inclination prompted me to advance, my reason bade me stand still. I'm afraid I have to delete some. E.G. Brown writes of the friendly relationship existing between the Zoroastrians and the Babis. And then he says, the marked predilection towards the Babis displayed by Manekji, the late Zoroastrian agent at Tehran, at whose instigation the Tarikh-e-Jadid, or new history of the Bab's manifestation, was written, must have reacted powerfully on the Zoroastrian brethren. But it is impossible to believe, writes Dr. Mary Boyce, that Manekji ever wished to encourage an interest in Bahá'ísm to the point of apostasy amongst his own community. And his predilection was presumably a manifestation of his natural intellectual curiosity combined with a general interest in religion proper to one born and bred in India. But the fact still remains that Manekji had the great privilege and bounty of attaining the presence of Baha'u'llah in Baghdad in 1954 on his return trip to Iran, and was greatly inspired and encouraged by him. Baha'u'llah gave Manekji Sáheb very valuable advice and guidance and prayed for the success of his mission. In a tablet revealed later to Manekji, Baha'u'llah writes, your letter came to this captive of the world in this prison. It brought happiness and increased friendship. It renewed the remembrance of the former times. Thanks belongs to the possessor of the universe, who permitted us to meet in the land of Arabia. We met, we conversed, and we listened. It is hoped that no forgetfulness shall ever forget that meeting. Ever follow that meeting. And the revolving of the wheel of time shall not pass away, its remembrance from the heart, and that the plants of love shall grow, out of which is sown and become green, verdant and imperishable. Manekji used to correspond with Baha'u'llah through his secretary Mirza Abul Fazl, asking many questions, and Baha'u'llah replied them in an indirect and veiled manner. Manekji, being unaware of this, repeats his question, and Baha'u'llah, in a 50-page tablet addressed to Mirza Abul Fazl, repeats the question, at times addressing Manekji as Sáheb Yagana, that is, unique Sáheb, and reminding him that he had answered them, and that the Janabe Manekji had not studied them, or else he would have comprehended them. Also, Baha'u'llah conveys his good wishes to Manekji, and states that God willing, Manekji would be guided to the recognition of the manifestation, and that God's munificence to him would not be curtailed, and to convey this wonderful message to his Parsi community and lead and guide them to the path of truth. Manekji asked Baha'u'llah questions such as whether Persian language is better or the Arabic language is better. And Baha'u'llah replies, you have written regarding the language, both Persian and Arabic are good. For that which one desires to gain from language is to attain to the meanings of the speaker, and this can be accomplished in both. And he says, as in this day the sun of wisdom has appeared and shone forth from the horizon of Persia, the more you respect this language, the better it is. Somehow I got this feeling reading about Manekji that he was quite biased against anything that was Arabic or Arabian. Manekji very boldly complains to Baha'u'llah that most of his tablets have been written in Arabic language, and that compared to the Persian language it is not very acceptable, as even the Arabs themselves do not seem to grasp the meaning of the Quran. And moreover, the Persian language is more acceptable to the Hindus and others, and he pleads with Baha'u'llah to use more Persian and reply him in the sweet, pure Farsi language. After this request, Baha'u'llah revealed some tablets to the Zoroastrians and believers from that background in pure Persian language without mixture of Arabic in it. Manekji too received a long tablet in pure Persian from Baha'u'llah, which is in the Star of the West, Volume 1. And unfortunately it says it's addressed to a Zoroastrian Baha'i, but it is addressed to Manekji, who never did become a Baha'i. A part of that tablet is quite pathetic when Baha'u'llah writes, "O friend, as there are few years to hear, so far, sometimes the pen has been silent in its own chamber, and to such a degree that silence has preceded utterance. Say, O people, words are revealed according to the capacity, so that the beginners may make progress. The milk must be given according to the measure, so that the babe of the world may enter into the realm of grandeur and be established in the court of unity." Baha'u'llah probably considered Manekji as the pure ground, for he addresses him in the same tablet as, "O friend, we have seen the pure ground and cast the seed of knowledge. Now it depends upon the rays of the sun, whether it burns up or is caused to grow. The sun of knowledge has appeared from behind the covering of the spirit, and all the birds of the meadow of oneness are intoxicated with the wine of understanding. Happy is the one who finds this and becomes immortal." And this is a very popular one that has been repeated by Baha'u'llah in quite a few places, and he repeats this. It is a very popular one that has been repeated by Baha'u'llah in quite a few places, and he repeats the same thing to Manekji. He says, "O friends, the tabernacle of unity has been raised. Look not upon each other with the eye of strangeness. Ye are all fruits of one tree, and the leaves of one branch." Although Manekji did not express his allegiance to the Bahá'í Faith, he showed great love and respect to Baha'u'llah and to the verities of his faith, and asked many questions to his secretary, Mirza Abul Faiz. The reply that Manekji got to the following question is oft-quoted and a familiar one to many Baha'is. The question Manekji asked was that in the previous revelation, the consumption of beef was forbidden, in another pork was forbidden, and yet others permitted it in their religion. And this seems to contradict with each other. And Baha'u'llah firstly reminds Janabi Sahib Manekji that in his previous tablets to him he had already answered that question, in which you have asked regarding the heavenly books. He says, "The all-knowing physician hath his finger on the pulse of mankind. He perceiveth the disease, he prescribeth in his unerring wisdom the remedy. Every age had its own problems, and every soul its own particular aspirations. The remedy the world needed in its present-day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age you live in, and center your deliberation on its exigencies and requirements. We can well perceive how the whole human race is encompassed with incalculable afflictions. We see it languishing on its bed of sickness, sore-tried, tried and disillusioned. They that are intoxicated by self-conceit have interposed themselves between it and the divine and infallible physician. They that have conceived the straight to be crooked, and have imagined their friend an enemy. Incline your ears to the sweet melody of this prisoner. Arise and lift up your voices, that happily they that are fast asleep may be awakened. Say, O ye who are dead, the hand of divine bounty proffereth unto you the water of life. Hasten and drink your fill. Whoso had been reborn in this day shall never die, and whoso remaineth dead shall never live. Thank you.